Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, can I analyze the case of Daniel Holtzclaw? Just a reminder, I'm not diagnosing anybody in this video, only speculating about what could be happening in a situation like this. If you enjoy this video, please like it, subscribe to my channel, and consider supporting me on Patreon. I'll put the link to Patreon in the description for this video. First, I'll look at the background of this case. I'll move to the timeline of the crime, then offer my analysis. Daniel Holtzclaw was born in the U.S. territory of Guam on December 10, 1986. He was raised in Enid, Oklahoma, with two older sisters. This town is about an hour and a half north of Oklahoma City. Daniel's father was white and his mother was Japanese. His father was a police officer in the same town where the family lived. Daniel played football in high school. In 2011, he ended up taking a job as a police officer in Oklahoma City. Over the course of 3 years, he was investigated regarding his use of force on 19 occasions, but he was cleared every time. On June 18, 2014, Daniel Holtzclaw completed his shift on the northeast side of Oklahoma City. His shift ran from 4 p.m. the previous day to 2 a.m. that day. At around 2 a.m., after his shift had been completed, Daniel left the police station and started to drive toward his residence. He was in his police vehicle. He turned off the computer in the vehicle, which was against department policy. Evidently, this is something he regularly did. Daniel said that he observed a vehicle swerving on the road. It was driven by a 57-year-old black woman named Janie Liggins. Daniel decided to pull her over despite being off duty. He also never reported the stop to police dispatch. Janie claimed that during the traffic stop, Daniel committed an assault involving oral sex, which lasted about 10 seconds. After this, Daniel let Janie go without giving her a ticket. About 3 hours later, Janie filed a police report against the officer. The next day, when Daniel reported for his shift starting at 4 p.m., he was questioned by 2 detectives. They read him his rights, and he agreed to speak with them without an attorney, which turned out to be a costly miscalculation. They interviewed him for 2 hours. Daniel denied the allegation. The detectives did not believe that Daniel was telling the truth. Daniel was placed on administrative leave, and some of his clothing was seized, like his uniform pants. The police continued their investigation. They contacted a woman who had made a claim similar to the current allegation against Daniel. She said that she was pulled over in May of 2014, driven to an isolated area, and assaulted. The police assumed that Daniel must have been responsible, even though the woman changed her story several times. The police believed they had detected a pattern of behavior. They contacted dozens of people who Daniel had interacted with through his job as a police officer. Almost all of the people who the police contacted were black women. Eventually, the police identified 20 people who said that Daniel had committed offenses against them. There were a variety of different types of offenses. 19 accusers were female, 1 was male. 7 of the accusers, including the male, were discredited, and 13 were considered to be telling the truth, at least by the state. The earliest incident was from December of 2013. Daniel was arrested on August 21, 2014. Eventually, he was charged with 36 different offenses, many of them related to sex. 5 months later, he was fired from the police force. Daniel's trial started on November 2, 2015. He was convicted on 18 of the 36 charges on December 10, which accounted for the offenses connected to 8 of the 13 accusers. Daniel was sentenced to 263 years in prison. He was denied parole in February of 2022. I can imagine the parole board stamping his application with the rarely used "rejected for applying centuries too early" stamp. Daniel is eligible to apply for parole again in February 2023. Now moving to my analysis. The case of Daniel Holtzclaw is controversial. There are many people on both sides of this case. People who say that Daniel was guilty assert that he was targeting poor black women in the area of Oklahoma City that he patrolled. This was a pattern of behavior. He was a terrible offender who was abusing his authority. People who say that Daniel is innocent accuse the police of tunnel vision. The police took one unfounded accusation and launched a highly focused and poorly managed investigation, during which they ignored exculpatory evidence and encouraged witnesses to magically remember how Daniel had committed crimes against them. Was Daniel Holtzclaw actually guilty? Let's take a look at the evidence, both for and against the idea that Daniel was guilty, starting with the inculpatory evidence. 13 different black women who Daniel interacted with accused him of 36 offenses, which took place at 17 different crime scenes. On June 18, 2014, when Daniel pulled over Jannie Wiggins, he had already turned off his computer, and he did not report the stop to police dispatch. Investigators found DNA from skin cells on the inside and outside of Daniel's pants near the zipper. The DNA matched a 17-year-old who accused Daniel. Daniel had given this teenager a ride home just a few hours before pulling over Jannie Wiggins. Daniel followed up on Facebook with one of his accusers. He asked her to call him, and he stopped by her residence. Now moving to the exculpatory factors. Despite having 13 different accusers, there were no witnesses to any crimes and no video of any crime taking place. Other than the one DNA sample, no physical evidence ties Daniel to any crime. The DNA sample could have made it onto Daniel's pants through secondary or even tertiary transfer. Daniel interacted with the victim, he searched her purse, perhaps her DNA transferred to his hand, and then from his hand to his pants when he used the restroom later. In addition to the alleged victim's DNA, the DNA from an unknown male was found in the same area of his pants. Was this unknown male also one of Daniel's victims? Clearly, DNA can get onto someone's pants without that person having committed a crime. While wearing those same pants, Daniel allegedly conducted 2 other attacks, but the DNA from those other accusers were not found on his pants. As far as the traffic stop of Jannie Wiggins that started the investigation, Daniel's DNA was not found on Jannie, and her DNA was not found on him. Jannie's driver's license had been suspended for 30 years, and she admitted that she had smoked marijuana just before being pulled over. Jannie claimed that Daniel made her put her hands on his police car during the attack, but her fingerprints were not found on his police car. The police tried to explain that Daniel's police car was full of trash, therefore finding a fingerprint on the outside would be impossible. Apparently, these investigators were not aware that the inside and the outside of the vehicle are different. Did they believe that Daniel was sticking trash on the outside of his car? Their argument makes no sense. Jannie changed her story several times and did not offer an accurate description of Daniel. For example, she said that he had blonde hair and he was 4 to 5 inches shorter than he actually was. Her description of the mechanics of how Daniel committed the offense did not match his clothing arrangement. Several of the other accusers also had credibility problems. One accuser supplied a story that contradicted data from Daniel's GPS. She also said that Daniel was a short black man. The accuser whose DNA was found on Daniel's pants was later arrested for attacking a man with a machete. One accuser denied that Daniel committed any offense 7 times before changing her story and implicating him. Many of the accusers had long histories of drug offenses and other crimes. It stands to reason that they were not members of the police fan club. Only 3 of the accusers came forward on their own. Investigators approached potential victims, explained to them what they thought happened, and they said Daniel was a bad guy, like they were giving the idea to the potential victim. This was the person's chance to get revenge on a police officer and make some money with a lawsuit. 12 of the 13 victims filed lawsuits. The state's argument makes it seem as though a person would never falsely accuse a police officer, yet there were 7 accusers of Daniel whose stories never made it to the trial. All of their claims were unsupported. Some of them said that Daniel offended against them after he was already on administrative leave and had no access to a police vehicle. One of them even admitted that she fabricated her claims, and she was convicted for falsely reporting a crime. Despite having no expertise in mental health, investigators determined right away that Daniel was a narcissist and evil. This motivated them to continue with their investigation. The judge who presided over Daniel's case had to resign from the bench. Reportedly, he was in bed with the prosecution. Not figuratively, but literally. He was having sex with a prosecutor. It wasn't the prosecutor for Daniel's case, but the judge's behavior was still problematic. Considering all the evidence in this case, do I think that Daniel is guilty? Here are my thoughts on this. As far as being guilty in reality, I think that he may have committed a few of the offenses. There is this sense that Daniel was interested in getting closer with women he had contact with during his job, like the whole incident with the Facebook message and visiting the person's residence. This doesn't prove that he was trying to force anybody to do anything, but it is not a great sign for him. Also, the DNA evidence does not look too good for him. As far as the legal standard, I do not think that Daniel was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. There is plenty of reasonable doubt in this case. The investigators deliberately targeted women who had criminal histories in an effort to find accusations against Daniel. They approached these women and told them Daniel was a bad guy who may have offended against them. It's not surprising that some career criminals would take advantage of that opportunity. I find it curious that when these women were arrested for various offenses earlier in their lives, the police called them liars, saying they could never be trusted under any circumstances. But when they agreed to accuse an officer after being supplied his name and what he allegedly did, the career criminals are angels who would never lie and had no incentive to lie. The investigators should not have underestimated the willingness of desperate criminals to fabricate stories to get money. The police made it easy for them. They gave them the entire story. They just had to say yes. It was like they were holding out a check for thousands of dollars and saying, "Would you like this check or not?" Here's my conceptualization of this case. This is just a theory, my opinion. Daniel Holtzclaw was an aggressive, sensation-seeking police officer who was actively looking for intimate interactions. He was messy and disorganized. For example, his police vehicle was full of trash. On the inside, not on the outside. He acted impulsively and did not fully appreciate the consequences of his behavior. Daniel turned off the computer in his police vehicle regularly because he didn't want anyone to know what he was doing. He took liberties with suspects and maybe even committed a few criminal offenses. Investigators latched onto one accusation and found accusers who had cash-induced memory restoration. They built a gigantic, flimsy case against Daniel when a more focused, smaller case may have been indicated. Daniel's alleged pattern of behavior fit with these social problems which were particularly prominent at this time. He was a bad police officer who was targeting black people. This put pressure on the state to push forward with a weak case in order to avoid civil unrest. The jury who heard Daniel's case became overwhelmed and confused by the evidence. They deliberated for 45 hours, as if they had carefully reviewed each case, but that's only about 3.5 hours per accuser, not nearly enough time to review the evidence carefully. They decided that if 13 people accused Daniel, he must have done something wrong. They decided to split the difference and convict Daniel in connection with 8 of the 13 accusers. Some of their acquittals and their guilty verdicts were inconsistent. For example, in one instance, they acquitted Daniel when his GPS placed him at the scene, and they convicted him for another offense when his GPS showed that he did not stop at the scene. Again, I think they were just overwhelmed. This case is an example of the state prosecuting someone based on every accusation imaginable and hoping that they will get a conviction somewhere. Daniel was convicted of 18 charges, but he was also acquitted of 18 charges. The state should not be proud of the case they built against Daniel Holtzclaw. A 50% guilty rate is consistent with a reckless prosecution. A suitable prosecution is like a laser-guided missile. Daniel's prosecution was like a shotgun blast. Those are my thoughts on the case of Daniel Holtzclaw. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comment section. They always generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found my analysis of this topic to be informative, Thanks for watching.